A U-boat lies in shallow waters off the Irish coast, watching and waiting. These are busy waters, and many ships, big and small, come and go, delivering desperately needed supplies to wartime Britain. At last, a target is spotted, but it's unlike any target the submarine's captain has seen before. Bizarre, abstract shapes cover the ship's hull and its upper works. Lines, dots, nondescript shapes mixed in with orderly stripes. The captain tries to get his bearings, but before he can tell what he's even looking at, the target has got away, and the U-boat is left behind, bemused. By World War I, militaries had experimented with camouflage before, and in conflicts like the Boer Wars, lessons had been learned the hard way that showed pipe-clad crossbelts and bright red tunics were very much a thing of the past. It's one thing to hide a soldier, but could you make something as large as a warship indistinguishable to the enemy? As the First World War dragged on and ships were lost by their hundreds and their thousands, some pretty bizarre designs began to appear. The story of how these crazy patterns emerged from the drawing pad to the North Atlantic is a great tale, and it involves some truly famous pioneering artistic minds, but the ultimate question is, did the camouflage actually work? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the story of how they came up with Dazzle Camouflage. Sometimes, in the middle of war, battle strategies and ideas can come from pretty unconventional people and places. Leonardo da Vinci, for example, was a great artist, but he was also a genius inventor who gave some pretty serious thought to warfare. So perhaps it should come as no surprise that the people rooted in naval camouflage were not just admirals, commanders, or naval architects. The real push actually came from a series of artists and animal experts. See, at the time, Britain's warships and troop transports were painted various shades of grey or black. Blackened out funnels like those of the Lusitania helped, in theory at least, to obscure the nationality and the class of the ship, which might give it just enough time to get away in case it was caught out by a U-boat or a marauding enemy cruiser. Britain's entire fleet of warships was painted dark grey from 1902 onward. Before then, the Victorian Navy had steamed out in a brilliant black, white and buff scheme that made the ships almost look more like passenger ferries, but enterprising minds had figured grey would blend in well to the ocean at a distance, and it's true. Nothing could obscure the telltale smudge of coal smoke on the horizon, but at long ranges, where the human eye tries to determine what exactly it's looking at, the atmosphere, the mist, the sea spray and the lighting can all muddle together into a kind of dull grey that something even as large as a warship could disappear into. By 1917, the big capital battleships of the Royal Navy were being painted a variety of shades, with the darker ones down at the hull and the lighter shades up towards the masts. Troop carriers and passenger liners followed suit, but there was one big problem. A grey ship could be difficult to find at range, that's true, but if it was spotted and followed, then nothing could protect it. If a troop transport just happened to blunder in front of a waiting submarine, for example, it wouldn't matter if the ship was painted grey or hot pink. The commander would be able to get a read on its length and its heading, its speed, and then compare that against the submarine's own position to calculate the ideal firing solution. 1, 2, 3 or more torpedoes could send the ship to the bottom in minutes. This began to happen en masse. Britain's vital sea routes were being choked by fleets of U-boats and auxiliary cruisers that hunted the merchant ships like foxes do chickens. Something needed to be done. Abbott Handerson Thayer was an American artist and naturalist. Long before the First World War, Thayer was an early pioneer in the field of camouflage. He'd written extensively about camouflage found in Mother Nature, how some animals and insects use disruptive colours to distort their outlines. Others, through use of various colours and patterns, could appear differently to a predator when observed from a distance. Thayer was especially interested in countershading. Countershading is a form of camouflage found in a variety of species of animals, from mammals and birds to fish, insects and reptiles. The basic concept is that an animal's colorization is darker on the top, but the same animal's color gets lighter as you get down towards their underside. Now, this natural design allows the animal to blend in more to their surroundings under natural lighting when viewed from above versus below. Now, Britain's Royal Flying Corps learnt this lesson too. Airplanes, which had once gone into battle in a nice, bright, unpainted canvas back in 1914, were fairly soon being painted dark olive green on top. Actually, it was really a pigment of natural iron oxide, or yellow ochre, and carbon black that came out looking olive instead of dark brown. And then, underneath, a light tan, so that to a patrolling fighter above, they might disappear into the landscape, while an observer below might not be able to spot them against a cloud. But Thayer leaned very heavily into the idea of counter-shading for warships. He and his friend, fellow artist George de Forest Brush, proposed naval camouflage based on specific coloration and counter-shading to the Department of the US Navy way back in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. Ships, they said, could be painted with counter-shading and patterns drawn from what they'd seen in nature. The Americans were actually receptive to the idea, but the fighting came to an end before any of the proposals could be put into action. Undeterred, Thayer and Brush kept up their work and experimented with different camouflage methodologies. In their studies, they conceived of a scheme that could see a ship painted with green wavy lines running up from the waterline, topped with a combination of red, green, and violet, which would cover everything up from the hull through the lifeboats, the masts, and the funnels. To them, this approach seemed to make the paint-applied ships simply disappear. They never lost interest in their ideas. By the outbreak of the First World War in Europe, they saw another opportunity to put them into action. Thayer toyed with a few concepts, at one point pushing to paint ships white and concealing their funnels with canvas to make them blend in with the ocean. Thayer even wrote directly to Winston Churchill in February 1915, proposing camouflaging submarines and painting ships white, and to his credit, the British Admiralty did consider their ideas, but ultimately rejected them. This certainly wasn't due to lack of persistence, because Thayer even travelled to England in November that year to make his case and give live demonstrations. Now, it wasn't all for nothing though, because Thayer's theories were approved for application on American naval vessels, and his ideas helped influence the formation of the American Camouflage Corps. This was a fascinating, although largely forgotten group made up of painters, sculptors, and designers from fine art schools all the way to Hollywood. Even legendary filmmaker Cecil B. DeMille assisted in an engineer's office. The camouflage theory remained alive and well, despite reluctance from the British government. In fact, at the same time Thayer was proposing his ideas, so was a fellow camouflage enthusiast that he'd met and befriended 2 decades earlier, John Graham Kerr. Kerr was a British zoologist, and he too proposed using disruptive camouflage during the First World War and took his inspiration from nature. His main objective for ships did differ from his friend Thayer though. Unlike Thayer, Kerr's idea was to disrupt a ship's outline, not to conceal it totally. He knew the problem at hand, that a ship, once spotted, could be a sitting duck. Maybe inspiration could be taken from nature to make it so that the ship's outline was so completely disrupted that getting an accurate bearing to target would prove impossible. In 1914, Kerr wrote a letter to Winston Churchill explaining the new approach. He compared his idea to well-known animals found in nature, like giraffes, zebras, and jaguars. Their biological patterns made them either blend in with their environments or confuse their predators from a distance. Kerr proposed specific ship applications like painting the ship's masts with bands of white. Now this was really important because calculating the mast height was crucial in determining target range for a U-boat skipper, and obscuring it or confusing it could make a torpedo miss by a mile. He also wanted to adopt counter-shading in a ship's paint scheme. The ship's guns should be painted grey on top and then transition to white towards the bottom. Brightly lit parts of the ship would be painted grey and shaded parts of the ship white, with transitional colouring in between to hide structures on board. Kerr's theories and ideas were sound, but he had trouble promoting them. The Admiralty heard Kerr's proposals, but they still remained sceptical. Essentially, they ignored him. He remained persistent and continued to write letters to the British government, but they never got back to him. Kerr would continue his work through World War I and beyond, later working with his student, fellow zoologist Hugh B. Cott during World War II. Cott actually proposed using more effective camouflage techniques for the British Army instead of the Navy. Cott, as did his mentor Kerr, pushed for adapting counter-shading, but like his mentor, he was not able to successfully influence policy. But turning our attention back to World War I, it was becoming more and more clear that the British Admiralty was going to have to try something radical. U-boats represented a serious existential threat to the nation. They were responsible for sinking more than 5,700 vessels and the deaths of over 12,700 non-combatants. Worse yet, at the time, there was very little in the way of negating their attacks. There were no set means to track small German submarines, and counter-offensive weaponry and detection systems were still in their infancy. Clearly, the ideas introduced so far by Thayer and Kerr were not without warrant. After all, camouflage was already an effective technique being used in land warfare, the idea of introducing it to a merchant fleet decimated by U-boats was certainly justified. Navies were having a hard time coming up with ways to obscure their ships in all weather conditions. So while the stars may not have aligned for Thayer and Kerr and their respective camouflage proposals, they certainly seem to have done so for Norman Wilkinson. Wilkinson was a painter, rather a famous one. He was a graphic designer and a newspaper illustrator. But interestingly, before the war, he had painted works that hung in some of the finest ships at sea. In fact, 2 of his had been mounted in the smoking rooms of the liners Olympic and Titanic. He took a pause from his artistic work to join the Royal Navy, reaching the rank of lieutenant in the Volunteer Reserve on submarines. But Wilkinson was eventually transferred to minesweeping duties closer to home, and it was then that he devised his camouflage ideas. It should be known that while Wilkinson receives a lot of attribution for the advent of naval Dazzle Camouflage, it wasn't exactly a brand new idea. See, the ancient Romans and the Greeks had even experimented with painting their ships blues and greens to try to blend them in with the ocean's surface. Of course, more recently, the British and the US navies had considered painting at least parts of their ships in various shades of grey or white. The story has it that in the spring of 1917, Wilkinson was on a weekend fishing trip when he suddenly got the inspiration for Dazzle Camouflage, and once he'd returned to the Royal Navy's Devonport dockyard, he rushed straight to his superior officer to relay his plan. In his own words, Wilkinson said, "I knew it was utterly impossible to render a ship invisible." So, much like Kerr, he set out to make ships look less discernible instead. Wilkinson's approach may have borrowed a little bit from nature, but it was very much rooted in the art style known as Cubism. Cubism involves painting different geometric shapes from different perspectives, interlocking planes, and collages. Pablo Picasso, for example, is one of the most famous artists who practice Cubism in his paintings. Wilkinson's idea was to break up the appearance of a ship using stripes of all different colours to confuse the enemy. Again, the idea was to utterly confound attacking vessels, not literally to hide the ship. A ship painted in what was to be known as Dazzle paint scheme would make it hard for the enemy to determine its size, speed, distance, and bearing. In addition to the black and white zigzag stripes, ships outfitted in Dazzle Camouflage would feature contrasting colours and irregular geometric shapes. So besides looking like a floating Picasso, in Wilkinson's own words, they were exploiting the limited view of the periscope. Wilkinson certainly didn't short himself in selling his camouflage idea. He took to making dazzle-painted models of ships, placing them on revolving tables, and having people view them through a periscope so he could have a practical demonstration of the idea. His status as an artist of considerable renown helped to no end. In fact, King George V himself was quite impressed. When he viewed the models through the periscope, he had guessed that the ship he was looking at was moving in a south by west direction, only to be surprised to learn that it was actually moving east by southeast. Not to leave any stone unturned, Wilkinson used screens, lights, and different backgrounds to demonstrate how Dazzle paint scheme would look at different times of day and night. Perhaps in part due to the devastating losses at the hands of the German U-boat fleet, and maybe in part due to the impressive demonstration, British officials were at last convinced by October 1917. They ordered virtually all merchant ships to receive special Dazzle paint schemes, and by the end of the war, over 2,300 British ships had been decorated in bizarre shapes, colours, and stripes. Some of the Admiralty's most famous ships were decked out in schemes that can only be described as chaotic. Also, some of the finest ocean liners in the world came out of yards boasting insane liveries that must have caused dock workers to stop and stare in awe. Olympic got 2 spectacular paint schemes that made her vast 50,000-ton hulk look like an abstract art project. Probably my personal favourite is that of the Mauritania late in the war with its huge diamond shape, almost chessboard-like pattern. Wilkinson was even authorised to set up a camouflage unit at the Royal Academy in London, where he was able to recruit other artists who were in turn given Royal Navy Reserve commissions. After showing much scepticism to Thayer and Kerr, the British were finally all in. In fact, the concept spanned more than one branch of the military because the British conducted experiments with applying Dazzle camouflage to aircraft as well. The effects of this weren't so clear, although it did help reduce the instances of anti-aircraft friendly fire because gunners were definitely not confused if aircraft above were on their side or not when they featured such a striking paint scheme. So, the key question for Dazzle Camouflage is, of course, did it work? After all, a lot of time, thought, and resources were put into its application, and after all this time and analysis, the answer is a thoroughly resounding, it's not exactly clear. Unfortunately, measuring the effectiveness of Wilkinson's camouflage approach is nearly impossible. You're dealing with a lot of hypotheticals and unknowns, and frankly, a bit of a catch-22. If a ship survived the war and it was painted with Dazzle paint camouflage, can you really guarantee that it was because of the camouflage without falling into the trap of confirmation bias? On the other side, if a ship sank that wasn't painted, could you definitely conclude that if it had been camouflaged, it would have survived? What's clear is that a few incidents demonstrate that Dazzle paint was not a sure method of protection from U-boats. In early 1918, the newly completed trooper Justitia, which featured another spectacular paint scheme, was attacked by the submarine UB-64. Of 5 torpedoes fired, 2 hit, 1 missed, and 2 others were destroyed by Justitia's gunners. The crippled ship was eventually finished off the next day by another submarine. Also in 1918, Olympic was ambushed by a waiting German sub that hit her dead center with a torpedo, which failed to explode, despite the fact she was painted stem to stern in a crazy Dazzle pattern. A post-war commission concluded that Dazzle camouflage probably only provided a slight advantage, and when pairing Dazzle camouflage with other tactics like sailing in zigzag patterns and especially traveling in convoy, the effect may have been enhanced. While a commission may not have found ample evidence of success, first-hand accounts may give some insight. Testimony from a U-boat captain later described it as the best camouflage he'd ever seen. Navies must have seen enough success firsthand as well, because in the Second World War, they began to apply the method to some of their ships. The British Navy had a more laid-back approach at the beginning of the war, but as it progressed, they began to take it more seriously again, and some of their cruisers and battleships featured more simpler patterns than those of the First World War. The German Navy, who didn't really show interest in camouflaging their ships during the First War, experimented with it briefly during the Second one, and some of their capital ships like Bismarck featured striking patterns that were intended to trick enemy subs. A favourite technique was to paint a fake bow wave to make it look like the ship was moving at full speed when it actually wasn't. What wasn't so obvious to the proponents of Dazzle camouflage was the shocking amount of maintenance that it actually took to maintain the paint schemes. This was especially true of the First World War, when big ships were largely coal-fired, and their hulls soon became caked in soot from bunkering or refueling, which obscured much of the scheme anyway. In the end, the world's navies figured that relying on greys would do the trick, and the benefits offered by Dazzle schemes in the age of radar and aerial spotting were virtually nil. John Graham Kerr must have felt the idea was a success though, because he actually went on to sue Norman Wilkinson for the credit of creating Dazzle camouflage, even though that effort was unsuccessful. In fact, Picasso had a go as well. We'll never really know how effective Dazzle schemes were during the First World War. Their introduction did kind of coincide with a drop-off in volume of tonnage sunk from about April of 1917, but this was also the same time Britain introduced a protected convoy system that saw ships sail together in big packs escorted by warships. But maybe, just maybe, if one ship was saved from destruction because the attacking captain was confused for a few minutes, then it might have all been worth it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.